Good morning and welcome to Promoting a Culture of Inclusion, Tips for Administrators. I'm Paige Carter and I'm a Technical Assistance Associate for VCU ACE, and I am drawing from some of my experiences as an administrator and autism specialist, and also, most importantly, a classroom teacher over the years. I have had many administrators who have supported me along the way, and we're drawing from that experience today to share with you.
And my name is Noel Woolard. I'm also a Technical Assistance Associate with the Autism Center for Excellence at VCU. And I'm really excited to be here today to share with you some really awesome tips that administrators can use to kind of create that culture of inclusion that will allow for all students to be successful. I too am a special education teacher, but I'm also a BCBA. And I've had many experiences as a classroom teacher supporting a variety of students. So without further ado, we're going to get started and introduce to you the agenda for this webcast. We're first going to talk about what inclusion is, and by doing that, we're also going to talk about what inclusion is not. We're going to spend a great deal of time talking about why inclusion is important in the first place. And then we're going to finish up with some tips that administrators can use to promote successful inclusionary practices within their building. Paige and I both hope that as we go through this webcast that we'll be able to provide information and strategies that administrators could use, but also anyone in the educational field. So first, let's start with the definition of inclusion. When you look at the research, there's a great deal of information that talks about what inclusion is not. We do know that inclusion is not a place, and it is certainly not just a practice. It's not a classroom, and it is not a methodology. Inclusion is a total mindset. It's the attitude of welcoming all individuals within the community and creating a deliberate climate where all individuals make a difference and are unique. Everyone within an inclusive setting has equal opportunities to grow and learn. Inclusion really is the culture of a building where all students, teachers, administrators, and parents believe that all children should learn and all children have the ability to learn and succeed. This next slide discusses the evolution of special education service delivery. With the passage of IDEA, schools are mandated to provide instruction in the least restrictive environment. Schools are also required to provide exposure to the general education curriculum to all students. So you'll notice that in one column we have the then, and then we move over to the now column. So this is kind of the progression that school districts have made as they have worked to provide more inclusive experiences to their students with disabilities. So for example, then there were self-contained classrooms or resource classrooms, and that's where the majority of students who had special education services and supports were educated. But now we see the shift to those students being included in the general education classroom with special education supports pushed in. Back then, we also saw that there was minimal collaboration between the special ed teachers and the general education teachers. Now we see that there's an emphasis on team planning where the special ed and the general ed teachers work together with the paraeducator, and they actually plan in grade level planning meetings. Back then, we found that instruction was provided only by a specialist or special education teacher, but now we see that school divisions are actually finding ways to put co-teaching practices in place that are very successful within their buildings. All of this, with the evolution of special education service delivery, can create some challenges for administrators, specifically in terms of scheduling, in terms of allocation of resources, and ensuring that supports are in place for all students.
We're going to talk a little bit more about inclusion, and what that really means is a belief and an understanding that all students with autism or any disability have the right to be educated in the least restrictive setting. And successful inclusionary experiences for students and for the adults in their environment really lead to outcomes related to social behavior. It really means the opportunity to make genuine friendships. We also have academic behaviors that learning to take instruction from a teacher and learning to be part of a classroom happens, and it happens in the real setting, and that's inclusion. We also see an increase in post-secondary outcomes, so learning those things that will enable them to serve as independent or to live as independent adults. And also the quality of life for students in their school environment and also post-school really improves with inclusionary experiences. So really, what outcomes do we want to achieve? And we know, based on what the Department of Education tracks and really what successful students are able to accomplish. So let's look at increased graduation rates. Standard and advanced diplomas, that's what everybody wants for their students, and that's what we want for our students with disabilities as well. We want decreased dropout rates. We want increased participation in the general education setting by increasing access to the general curriculum, including assessments and all of the standards of learning that everyone else is getting. We really want to increase parent participation as well. And inclusionary practices allows a welcoming environment so that parents feel like they're welcome to participate too. We also want to increase those post-secondary outcomes for all students. So being able to enter into training beyond high school is important and an outcome that we're looking to see. In this graph, you see a breakdown of students with autism across the state of Virginia and what type of diploma they received. And I think the most important takeaway from this slide is that all kinds of diplomas are being achieved by students with autism. And I would really like to point out the number of advanced diplomas and the number of standard diplomas that are being achieved by our students are increasing every year. And also the number of special diplomas that are being achieved are increasing. And that really connects to the increase in the number of students with autism. But to really, as a school, understand that students with autism can meet the standards that everyone else does. And by this graph, we're seeing an increase in that every year. And this is the same graph marked for all students with disabilities. And again, the takeaway for me from this graph is that the majority of students with disabilities earn a standard diploma. Knowing that will raise our expectations for all students with disabilities. So things that maybe previously, like in Noel's slide, we were talking about then, maybe then we thought that that wasn't something that is achievable, but clearly it is.
On this slide, Paige and I really want to share with you that we think this is the most important slide in this entire webcast. We believe that creating a culture of inclusion is really the first step, that foundational step to building a school that actually embraces all and believes that all students are part of the school community. So the first thing that the administrator can do to kind of create that culture of inclusion is to identify any barriers that might exist that may hinder that culture of inclusion. So one of the things that some school divisions have kind of started looking at are looking at their policies and procedures, whether they are formal or informal procedures and policies that kind of determine the placement of students with disabilities. So we're looking at this as making sure that the disability does not drive the placement. The placement for students with disabilities is driven by the goals and objectives that are agreed upon in their IEP. We also want to make sure that we look at potential barriers of biases. And we want to make sure that our students really are supported by teachers who believe that all students can learn and staff members that believe all students have the right to be in that setting. The second variable on this slide focuses on three different components. We want to make sure that the services that we're providing, the supports that we're providing to all students are through equality, quality, and equity. So as we unpack each one of these words, let's look at equality. We want to make sure that in our school building, the culture is to include all students when it comes to assemblies, field trips, after-school programs, those types of things. We want to make sure our students have the same access as any other student. We also want to look at the quality of the education. We want to make sure that supports are put in place that are individualized to those specific learning characteristics. And then we also want to make sure that things are equitable. We want to make sure that if there is a special dance, that all students are invited to participate in that special dance. Clubs, all of our students or any student within the building is invited to participate in any of the clubs as well. So we want to really make sure that we're looking at equality, quality, and equity. Another variable is making sure that all members of the school community are treated equally regardless of their differences. So I'm thinking about gender, race, socioeconomic status, any differences that they may have that may make them different from others in their building. The next variable that we would want to look at would be to make sure that structures, resources, and supports are identified and accessible to promote inclusionary practices. Sometimes we need to make sure that in our budgets we have set aside money to make sure that there is time for professional development for staff members, that we have built-in time within the day to make sure that our teachers can collaborate together and work to provide the best instruction that they can. And then finally, we also want to make sure that inclusionary practices are modeled by leadership in the building and in the division. We want to make sure that the building level principal actually shows that in what they do, in the emails that they send out, and their communications to families and to staff, that all students have the right to actually be part of every single activity and anything that happens within that building. So in the field of education, administrators who really work towards any sustainable change within their building are what we call a transformational leader. And a transformational leader is a leader that works with members of their staff to kind of identify problems that may be barriers or maybe things that are not going so well within their building, and then develop a plan for improvement and then implement that plan. So Salisbury and McGregor, in their research, they identified 3 different types of leadership characteristics that elementary school principals have. And so I'm going to read each one of these different leadership characteristics, and I want you to think in your mind back to maybe when you were a teacher, when you had a leader, either a principal or a central office staff, that kind of fit in one of these leadership characteristics that we're going to talk about. And I want you to think back to how you felt. Did you feel supported? Did you feel like you were valued as a team member? Did you feel like you wanted to stay and continue to be part of that community? Or did you decide to leave and look for a community elsewhere? So I'm going to start first at the very bottom. A restrictive leader. Salisbury and McGregor describe that as an individual that hinders and does not facilitate any teacher work. Teachers are burdened with paperwork, committee meetings, and these may actually interfere with their teaching responsibilities. So that's a description of a restrictive leader. A directive leader is one that's very tight in terms of their monitoring of teacher behavior, maintains strict control over all teacher and school activities. So that's kind of someone who micromanages every single little thing. Memos cannot go out unless they are approved by that leader within that building. So sometimes things may not necessarily get done in a timely manner. Sometimes they may not get done at all. The last leadership characteristic described by Salisbury and McGregor is a supportive leader. So that's someone who demonstrates true concern for teaching staff, listens to the teacher's concerns, is very open to teacher and staff suggestions. Staff genuinely believe that the administrator values their work and their individuality. And I believe, and I think Paige does too, that this is the definition of a transformational leader. Someone who actually makes sure that the folks within their community, specifically their staff, feel valued and feel like what they do actually matters.
And I think, Noel, I wanted to comment that when you are in a supportive environment like that, it empowers you to really keep the main thing, which is instruction.
Right.
And when you're bogged down by all these other things, you kind of lose your love of why you became a teacher in the first place. And that sounds kind of heavy, but I think that the administration of a building sort of has the ability to make or break that for a teacher. And I find this so very important. So. The next thing we're going to talk about is building awareness about parental involvement and collaboration. And we all have heard about parental involvement and how important it is over the years. And I think teachers do make an effort to do that. You know, we schedule conferences and we make phone calls and we send notes home and things like that. But this kind of parental involvement goes a little bit deeper than that when we're talking about inclusive practices. And we really want to make sure that we are including parents in the same way that we want to include students. So the first step is to really step back and realize that there's an entire life happening outside of school for all our families, not just those with disabilities. But I want you to consider for just a second what it might be like to have a child with a disability and to really sort of encounter issues every day related to that. So it kind of adds a layer to what is already a pretty complex structure, which is living in a family. So if you could really just kind of step back and think about that when you're scheduling meetings or making decisions about family involvement. The next thing is, there are multiple tensions and responsibilities inherent to raising a child with autism. So what we really want to think about is those multiple tensions and what that might be like. So for example, if a student has tardies, or something like that related to their disability, or maybe disciplinary actions related to disabilities and things like that that sort of complicate things at school, those same things go on at home. So it really is important before we pass judgment to just kind of step back and consider what that might be like. Families need to interact with the school in different ways, and that's true for all families, but it's more so for students who have a disability in their families. We really have to be responsive to these unique needs and circumstances of each family, and it is a little bit more than lip service to schedules and things like that. It really is taking back and trying to really consider what it might be like and taking that into consideration in your interactions with families. So this is a bit of a soapbox issue for me, for my friends who know me. But if parents are to participate fully as a member of a team at school, especially when you're considering things like IEP and eligibility, they need the same information as all of the other team members. The meetings that have gone smoothly in my memory are the ones where teachers got the information to the parents on an ongoing basis. And especially when planning for a meeting, they got it in plenty of time. I would say 2 weeks ahead of time. So the family would have enough time to really process and think about goals and what they really want for their student over the next year, and to really think about the progress they've made or the progress they haven't made. And when teachers and administrators are able to communicate with the family on an ongoing basis, there aren't any surprises when we come into these meetings. And so meetings that could be quite contentious will actually be something that everyone looks forward to. And thinking about that, the parent perspective is really critical in achieving educational outcomes. And you've heard the parent knows their child better than anyone else. And that while that really is true, it's also important to consider that the parents and the family members and the students may have worked together to sort of come up with goals for what they want their life to look like after school and what the quality of life will be like. So really asking parents, what are your priorities? What's the most important thing is very important. Collaboration takes work, and it takes time, and it doesn't happen by accident. It's something that you have to be very intentional about. And I hear Noel smiling next to me. It really is something that you have to do on purpose. And when you fail to do that and then sit back and I wonder why this isn't going well, there really was something missing. And I think that was the time and the work in building those relationships that happen over time. And for principals, that collaboration could not be more important. When a principal is the head of a building and meets a new student in kindergarten, they're going to be following that student for many, many years. A teacher may only have that family or that student for 1 year, but the principal is going to keep going with them. So I would say that the relationship with the principal might be as important as the relationship with the teacher, maybe even a little more. I keep saying be intentional. It's my favorite thing. But we really have to be intentional and do things on purpose when we're building relationships. And we have to do that every step of the way. So from that first greeting at the first open house at the very beginning of a school year in your building, all the way to when that season is over and they're moving on to another school or on to post-secondary life, we really have to be intentional about knowing the students and knowing their families and what the needs are there. And remember, most of all, that there is not a one-size-fits-all approach to parental involvement. We've talked about the unique needs of families and the unique needs of students, but there's also unique needs of the teams and what all of that means. So really considering those individualized approaches to collaboration is really important when working with families. So remember that parental involvement is variable. Not every family is going to be able to participate to the same degree or in the same way as another family. And studies indicate over and over that educators often fail to include parents as valued members of the IEP team. Our first bullet was making sure they had all the information, but this is more about believing and knowing that the parents are valued members of the IEP team. This doesn't mean that the parent makes every single decision and comes in and slams their, fist on the desk and then that's what we do. That's not what that means. When you have a collaborative environment, no one's going to come in and do that anyway. So it's really important to really take time to build relationships and find out what parents are interested in, what they value for their students. So when you sit down at the table, we're all on the same page. The other thing that principals really need to do is build awareness of the benefits of all these things and working with families in a collaborative manner. Like Noel was saying about modeling that culture of inclusion, it's also important to model this culture of parent involvement and how positive that can be and what a difference it can make in your school. So, there's that word, be intentional again. You can tell I wrote that slide. Remember that families have unique circumstances. We're wrapping up here. And also be available and responsive to parents as much as possible. Principals are very busy and they get a lot of phone calls. But just being able to have some kind of policy, if I can't get right back to you, I'll get back with you within 48 hours or something like that. So parents know that you are available to them. The other thing too is whether it's the senior principal in the building or an assistant principal who participates in IEPs or other mandated meetings, that be a consistent person as much as possible so those relationships can be formed. And then the administrator learns to know the needs of the students and can be a truly active member of the team. The principal is the one who commits resources on that team for the building. So it is important for you to know all of the needs that student has now and may need in the future. Encourage your staff to have frequent and consistent communication with parents so there are no surprises. We talked about that earlier, but it really is important. And I encourage them to really share classroom data that they have, whether that's grades in a general education setting or even behavioral data from a behavior plan, to make sure that is something that the parents are hearing about all along the way and isn't a surprise at the annual meeting. And also encourage teachers to really share progress, good stuff, not just the stuff that is challenging. So those notes or phone calls home when there's a problem can't be the only communication that happens. And we know that, but in the throes of being really busy and doing all the things that teachers and administrators have to do, we do have a tendency to make those phone calls when it's absolutely necessary. So those positive notes home, positive calls home are really important too. And explore ways to include families in your larger school community, get them involved. And the more the more time parents spend at school, more time they spend at school and the more things that they're able to participate in the community really helps them to feel included as well.
Okay, so a couple slides ago we talked about the benefit that students may have being included in a general education classroom based on the principal's belief that they could actually receive a quality education there. So let's shift a little bit from that kind of thought about the principal, and let's look at the thoughts and the attitudes of teachers towards the inclusion of students with disabilities. So I'm going to read a quote here. The lack of special education experience and training can have a profound effect on teacher attitudes towards inclusion of students with disabilities. So what does this really mean? Well, it really means that as a principal or as an administrator, we have to be really planful about the type of professional development that we're offering to our teachers. We want to make sure that we provide professional development that is rich and is really matched to the different activities and the different strategies that they really should be implementing in the classroom. We know that first we need to provide a level of training and instruction, and then we need to make sure that training and instruction is actually implemented in the classroom, hopefully with some type of fidelity. And then we want to make sure that teachers have some way to receive some type of feedback so that they can know whether or not they can improve on those practices or if they're really hitting the mark exactly how they need to be. So I want to share a story of one of my students that I worked with who happened to be in kindergarten. I was a self-contained teacher, and this student happened to have autism. And in his IEP, he was to be included in a kindergarten classroom during calendar time. And so the principal had the belief that all students could actually do well in the general education setting with the proper supports. So she identified a teacher, a general ed teacher, who had a great deal of experience. She had been teaching for 20 or 25 years, and she was the kind of teacher that everybody knew just accepted anybody that came into that classroom. So on the first day of school, I crossed the hallway with my kindergarten student, and we sat in calendar time. So we're all on the carpet. All the students are on the carpet. There's about 25 of them. And my student with autism starts to engage in some self-stimulatory behavior. He starts flapping his hands, moving around a little bit. As the I was the teacher, but I was in that classroom as a shadow, and I started feeling really anxious. I started feeling that maybe my student was going to distract all these other kindergarten students. Maybe the classroom teacher was going to ask us to leave. And as I got up to kind of move my student to a different area of the carpet, the classroom teacher put her hand up to me and said, "No, he's okay, he's fine, just let him stay." And so that's kind of how the entire quarter went, with us going into calendar time, my student engaging in some self-stimulatory behavior, not really seeming to me that he was really engaged or participating. But at the end of that quarter, the kindergarten teacher asked if she could do her benchmark testing on that student, just as she was doing with all of her other students. And wouldn't you know it, that student, who I thought really wasn't getting a huge amount of instruction because of his self-stimulatory behavior, scored exactly the same as all of the other kids that had been sitting in that same calendar time. So for me, it was a huge take-home point. This was a teacher who was a general education teacher, but she had a great deal of experience. And she believed that this student, my little kindergartner, had the ability to learn the same material as all of the other kids in her classroom. And she was right. So I learned a huge lesson in that way, and it has shaped so many of my experiences since then.
You know, I've had similar experiences as well where I was very nervous, especially early on. I was an early childhood special education teacher, so as I would transition my students to kindergarten and really wanted them to be in the inclusive setting, I would get really, really nervous. And I think that, you know, I've had far more positive experiences, and students have exceeded every expectation we've had. So really giving them the opportunity makes a big difference.
Absolutely, absolutely. Okay, two facts that keep coming up in the research over and over again that I want to share with you. The first one is that teachers with less teaching experience and less educational experience are the ones that tend to provide instruction to our most difficult students, our students that struggle behaviorally and sometimes academically. That's just a fact. The second fact is that teachers who are new teachers to the field, who have just graduated from four-year colleges and universities, are equipped with some pretty good skills, but many of them are not equipped with the skills needed to modify curriculum, to adapt curriculum, and even to differentiate curriculum to a variety of learners. So, as administrators, we need to remember these two facts when we're planning our meaningful professional development. We need to make sure that the professional development that we're providing is not just to provide strategies that might be great for one subgroup of kids, but we want to think about all of the students that are within that building, and we want to think about all their diverse needs as well. So as we plan our professional development, think about providing professional development on practices that are known to be effective for all learners. So that might be making sure that visual supports are in place, or teachers understand how to use visual supports, graphic organizers, any of those tier 1 interventions that we know really should be in play or in place in all of our classrooms. We also need to make sure through our professional development that we encourage teachers to always see the strengths and the true learning potential of every student. We want to make sure that every student is given the same opportunity to master and learn material, just like my little kindergartner who was pushed into his calendar time. And then we also want to make sure that we model and expect a positive disposition or a positive attitude towards the active learning of all students. So we want to make sure that our teachers are welcoming and engaging and very positive in the way that they interact with our students. Every student. We want to make sure that kids enjoy going into those classrooms because they know that they'll be encouraged to learn new information and material.
So in supporting and providing opportunities for teams, it's really important, as Noel said, to be thoughtful about selecting teams. And I know over the years, especially when co-teaching first became a big thing during our careers, it seems like it's been a while, but it was, the principal sometimes took volunteers or teachers would be voluntold that they were going to be on the co-teaching team this year. And training would be provided, and that would be either a really successful thing or a not so successful thing. And I'm not sure we did a lot of analysis between the two. What makes a successful team, and is that something that's benefiting the students, or are we just checking a box? We have collaborative teaching teams here at our school. So it is really important to be really thoughtful when selecting teams and considering the dynamics within that team once the teams are selected. So I know that we have a tendency to kind of go with no news is good news when we're busy, but that's not how that works, because a lot of teams, whether it's a teacher and a paraprofessional or teachers or an entire teaching team, sometimes there are dynamics going on there under the surface that really may impact instruction. And so it's important to kind of keep your finger on the pulse of that and let your teachers and your teams know that that is important to you, that you want to know what's going well and what's not going well, and let them know that you want to support them in that. That makes an enormous difference in really wanting to make the team work, knowing that your leader finds this important. So check in regularly. Just make that part of, when you're doing your rounds, see how things are going. Ask the paraprofessional how it's going. Ask if she's getting or he's getting what he needs to really do what's best for students and really carry out those instructional tasks that they've been given. Provide planning time. I know it's hard. I can feel it from the other side of the screen. That is a really hard thing to do. But whether that's planned into the day or planned during some kind of specials activity or something like that during the day, but really taking time with that master schedule every summer and making sure that you're teaching teams and have time to collaborate and really make those modifications and accommodations that are necessary for students, all students, not just students with disabilities, to be successful. And if there are resources that your teachers need, do your very best to provide them and sort of budget that ahead of time to know that there might be something that might make learning a lot more effective for students. And there's a quote here at the bottom that I'd like to read to you. Specifically, administrators influence these relationships through how they provide direction, the presence and availability to support educators and encourage collaboration, and their swiftness and responsiveness in addressing problems that arise. So it's really important for you to really keep your finger on the pulse of how those relationships are going and to really be an active part of all of that. Oh, this is me too. Evaluating the school climate is really important. So I know that back to that no news is good news thing, sometimes we kind of walk around, because I'm sort of a particularly happy person, and so I think that if I don't hear of anything that's going poorly, I have a tendency to think of everything as half full. So if we don't really consider the school climate on purpose, be intentional about it, we may miss something. So it's important to create ways for students and teachers and staff to rate the school's inclusionary practices. So this could be something like a 5-minute reflection at the beginning of your staff meeting every week to really think about, take a topic with inclusion, say extracurricular activities, and how you're using inclusive practices to make students feel welcome and to sign up for those things and be a part of it. But taking the time to really reflect on these practices will give you an idea of what the school climate is like. Also create ways to get feedback regarding changes that you make. So, an open door policy is always helpful, but maybe a little formal exit ticket or something like that where teachers can report to you, whether electronically or on a little piece of paper, how they're feeling about stuff. Maybe make it anonymous so they feel comfortable providing information. And you'll get as many positive feedback as you do negative, but it's important to really know what your teachers and your staff are feeling about the climate, and also parents and students. Also, allow opportunities and create processes for self-reflection in the classroom. I earned distinction as a national board certified teacher some years ago, and I will tell you that the biggest piece of that staff development for me was learning self-reflection. So getting your teachers to really think about exactly what they're doing that is promoting student learning and allowing them to take credit for that. A lot of times if a student does really well, we say, wow, that student's working hard. But if a student is doing poorly, we think, what is that teacher not doing? So really empowering your teachers to be responsible and take responsibility for the things that are going well in their classroom and the things that they're creating or implementing that are making a difference. So there are some formal ways to evaluate school climate. There's an example here on the screen, the Organizational Climate Description Questionnaire for elementary schools. There's also one for secondary schools. It's been used in several research studies to really evaluate school climate. So that is something that you can do if you're interested in a more formal measure.
Okay, so Paige opened the door to the discussion of evaluation and talking about evaluating school climate. But we also have to talk about evaluating classroom practices that the teacher is engaging in. But before we even start to think about doing that, we want to make sure that as the administrator in that building, you are supporting that teacher and you are seen as a positive thing when that teacher sees you in their doorway and coming into their classroom. We want to make sure that teacher feels very, very comfortable with you, the administrator, near them and knowing all the things that they do day in and day out. So some things that you can do as an administrator is make sure that you're present in and out of the classroom. Don't just walk into that teacher's classroom when there's a problem lurking or when there's an issue or a concern. Make sure you're in that classroom when good things are happening as well. Make sure that you know the students by name. Make sure you kind of have an idea of what their areas of their strengths and areas in need of development are for the teacher, but also for the student. So kind of have a general idea of those folks that are in your building, teachers and students alike. I had a principal who often did walkthroughs through my classroom, and it got to a point when I saw her, I was actually excited because I knew that there was going to be some type of positive feedback that she was going to leave me. And she typically had like a pad of Post-its, and she would put a smiley face on one of them and stick it to my computer and leave. She never bothered my instruction, or she would write a little note like, I loved how you provided that whole group, you provided instruction during that whole group lesson. And so I actually had a collection of all these different Post-it notes that I put on my bulletin board, and when I was having a really hard day, I could look at those Post-it notes and kind of remind myself that there were good things that were happening in my classroom.
Right. I'd like to provide sort of a non-example. I'm not,
Okay.
and I have something like that too, and it's kind of a funny story. I was teaching during a social skills time. I had fourth graders with intellectual disabilities and some with autism in a social skills group. There were also some typically developing peers in this social skills group, and an administrator walked into our room and opened the door, and she stood there and she looked around and sort of everything stopped. I tried to keep teaching, but all of my students, as they often do when someone came to the door, turned and looked, and the administrator didn't say anything. She just turned around and walked away. And so one of my students, who's a little bit precocious and really learning some new social skills, raised his hand and said, Miss Carter, I think she's mad at you. And I thought to myself, I think she might be too. But I said, no, of course not. She's just seeing what we're doing, and went on. But in my heart, I did wonder, was something going on that she didn't like, because there wasn't a positive note, and there wasn't and often that is the same administrator who might put a simple note in my box that says, see me, with no explanation. A little bit worried. Now, every single time that I was able to go to the office and discuss things with her, it was very positive. I didn't have a negative relationship with her at all. But the important thing was that my student thought that there might be a problem, because we talked about coming in a room and greeting and being positive and things like that. Well, she probably just didn't want to interrupt instruction.
Absolutely.
But it was kind of an example of how maybe that can be misinterpreted. So
absolutely. So as an administrator, just make sure that you're seen and in the classroom, and that you are providing positive feedback to the teacher when you do see great things happening in that classroom. Okay, So let's kind of shift back to talking about evaluation, because that is necessary, as you all know. So we want to make sure that we have different ways to evaluate what's happening in the classroom, but we're also providing meaningful feedback that can be used for improvement. So the first type of feedback that I really like is feedback that a teacher can receive from a peer. So this is an excellent way for a teacher to kind of get some feedback from someone who's doing the same things that they're doing on a daily basis. Peer feedback seems to be a little safer than feedback from your administrator. Also, when you have peer feedback, you can learn some strategies that maybe your peer has been implementing successfully that maybe you had not thought to even implement in the first place. So it's a great way to kind of to get feedback, but also to grow together as peers. As a principal, you need to make sure that there are times set aside for peers to observe others, though. So that comes back to our scheduling and good use of resources. The second thing that I'd like to talk about is an online tool that we have created at the Autism Center for Excellence. And this is a tool that is called Teacher Performance Standards and Evaluation Criteria for Special Education Teachers. So this is a tool that administrators can use that is on our website that breaks down the 7 standards and that has indicators that are specific to what you would want to see in a special education classroom. It is 100% modeled after the VDOE, Teacher Performance Standards Criteria. So as an administrator, you can use this document as you walk into classrooms to kind of see which of these indicators are present or are not present. Another tool that we have on our ACE website is the Performance Standards and Evaluation Criteria Scoring Rubric for Special Education Teachers. So for those administrators who may not be as knowledgeable about some of the indicators that are in the Teacher Performance Standards, this rubric will kind of help you identify and describe what some of those strategies, indicators might look like in the classroom and kind of help you as you evaluate where your teachers may be.
The other thing that I really loved about this tool when I used it to evaluate my teachers was really to be able to have those conversations with them. So we would sit down with this rubric and really talk about what I saw in the classroom, and they could sort of do a sort of self-reflection about some other things that they do, and the whole time I was learning and they were learning, and it was a really powerful tool just for interacting with your teachers too.
Absolutely. And another way that I've used this tool is actually as a self-evaluation for teachers. So I've given this tool to teachers and say, where do you think that you fall on this continuum in terms of implementing some of these strategies? So teachers can kind of identify areas that they want to grow in, and it can help them kind of determine what they want to focus on in terms of their SMART goal.
Sure.
Another resource that we do have on our VCU ACE website is a fact sheet. This one's not as colorful as some of the fact sheets that we have, and I think there might be a different version of this on our webpage. But this is a fact sheet that outlines the foundational 5. And so at the Autism Center for Excellence, we believe that there are 5 practices that are foundational practices that should be in all classrooms. And those practices are antecedent-based interventions, visual supports, systematic instruction, reinforcement, and social communication intervention. So if you're an administrator that's trying to figure out what types of support should be in a classroom to support all learners, not just those with autism or with any other disability, you might want to start with these first foundational 5 and see which of these practices are in place in the classroom. And if they're not, this might be an area that you might want to develop some planful professional development around.
And I'd like to just throw in a plug for the performance criteria, the standards again. For example, the first one on the bullet list is antecedent-based intervention, which is all those preventative strategies that teachers use to set up and promote instruction. So an example of that might be to use a visual support and use that in order to prime the student for learning or to remind them to stay in their seat or something like that. So, and that preventative strategy ties right back to that performance criteria, and it's embedded throughout all 7 of those. You know, teacher planning and really setting up instruction. So really used together, those can be really powerful tools for principals and understanding really what should be happening in that setting.
Absolutely. And for those administrators who may want some additional instruction on what an antecedent-based intervention is and what it looks like in our online courses, if you go into the training and resource tabs on our webpage, you will see some online courses, the evidence-based practice course that is exceptional, and it will give you lots of information so that you can kind of help your teachers implement some of these strategies in their classrooms.
Well, and using those courses and some of these other resources can really increase your confidence in really speaking to and about students with disabilities and working with families in meetings and things like that.
Absolutely.
Well, we just, oh, go ahead.
Sorry. No.
We have a list of resources here for you, and I really want to introduce you to these first two. We have a webcast very similar to this one done by our friend Josh Taylor, who really talks about strategies for educators for inclusion. And we also have one by Cindy Petoniak, who is another Technical Assistance Associate here at ACE, who really talks about meaningful inclusion and what that is. And this webcast is actually a two-part series. And Cindy is kind of known for inclusive practices and the things she's been able to implement over her career. Both of these webcasts are really great tools for teachers and administrators alike.
And I'm going to introduce you, if you haven't already found the links to these two different resources. But the first is the link to the Virginia Cohort data. And this is something that I recently found online as I was kind of trying to pull up information specific to some of the school divisions that I support as a technical assistance associate. And so what the four-year cohort reports are, they are detailed information that looks at data from each school division, and the data is already disaggregated. So you don't have to go in and actually count numbers of students yourself. All of the information is given to you. So a cohort, for those of you who may not know, a four-year cohort is a group of students that enter 9th grade altogether, and a cohort is followed through the 4 years that they are in high school. And so some of the different pieces of information and data that are collected are the types of diplomas that students within that cohort receive, the number of students that drop out of high school within that cohort, the number of students who qualify for special education services, the pass rates of every single subgroup within that school division. Now, data is reported for subgroups that have 10 or more students within that subgroup. If there is less than 10 students within that subgroup, DOE does not report that data because they feel like it might be providing some identifiable information about specific students.
Right, and while this data really provides information about some really quantitative kinds of things, I've talked to principals who've also used it for softer things, like for example in the class of 17, back when they started high school in 2013, or the fall of 2012, I guess, I totally did that math wrong, but anyway, during the time of their cohort, they implemented some things school-wide. And so they were able to sort of compare that class with classes before them to really look at specifically dropout rates, because they added some supports into the school for all students. And so they were able to use that to sort of compare to see if there were some softer signs that was really having an impact.
That's awesome. Well, and as behavior analysts, we're constantly seeking data that gives us information about what might be happening within school divisions.
We do love data.
We do. And so this four-year cohort data can actually provide one piece of data to kind of maybe suggest how well our inclusionary practices are working with our students with disabilities. And are we really looking at providing equitable educational services across the entire school division for all students?
Right, and every time we look at this data, or we sit with a school division and look at data like this, there are always some surprises. So it's really important to really kind of be part of that, sort of check-in that we talked about earlier, to really kind of do a sort of quantitative check-in too.
Absolutely. Okay, and so many of you may already be familiar with this, but this is the Special Education Performance Report. So the federal government actually has guidelines and criteria, and certain things that they expect states to kind of take data on and measure progress on. The states can kind of determine how they're going to collect data on that and monitor progress. And so what the Virginia Department of Education does is that they have special education indicators where school divisions have to provide data on things like least restrictive environment percentages for preschool, least restrictive environment percentages for school-age population, dropout rates, post-secondary outcomes, disciplinary action. And so I'm not going to pull up a specific school division, but you guys can certainly do that yourself. But you can pull up the most recent data, which would have been from December 1, 2016 at this point, that looks at kind of how does the school division actually measure up in terms of progress monitoring on these indicators. Mm-hmm. And you can go back and you can compare from year to year to year to see if that school division is making progress or maybe even slipping backward a little bit.
Right, and I think being informed on matters such as these really does provide information that helps you to provide an inclusive setting and to really build that culture of inclusion.
Absolutely. Okay, so in leaving you guys today, we kind of wanted to wrap up this webcast with this quote, because we really feel like it pulls together every single thing that we talked about today in terms of talking about principals and their effect on inclusion in their buildings. Administrators drive effective programs for students with ASD. No program or support is effective without administrator or principal support. And that quote is from the great Kathleen Quill in her book that she wrote in 2011.
All right, and we have at the end of our slides, we have some references for you, but we just want to take some time to really thank you for all of the work that you do to support students with autism, students with disabilities, and all students across the Commonwealth. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.